The morning of October the 12th, 2018, broke over the town of Oakhaven with a bitter, biting wind. It was the kind of cold that seemed to sink right past your skin and settle deep into your marrow. Down at the county fairgrounds, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee diesel exhaust and the quiet, heavy desperation of men who were watching their livelihoods vanish into thin air. It was the annual foreclosure and liquidation auction, a graveyard for broken dreams and bankrupt farms. The auctioneer's gavel cracked against the wooden podium, echoing across the gravel lot like a gunshot. Lot number 42 was being dragged out by an old rusted winch truck, tearing deep, ugly grooves into the frozen earth. It was not even listed as a tractor on the manifest. The auction sheet simply read, "Scrap iron of unknown origin," and looking at it, you would understand why. It was a monstrous fused block of oxidation and decay. Thorny vines had literally grown through the cracked engine casing. There were no rubber tires left, only jagged, flaking iron wheels that looked like they belonged in the 19th century. The entire crowd of local farmers took a collective step back, murmuring and shaking their heads at the miserable sight of it. But standing near the very back of the crowd, away from the murmurs and the cheap coffee, was Elias Thorne. Elias was a man carved from the very dirt he worked. He was 68 years old, with hands like cracked leather and a quiet, stubborn strength that refused to bend to the wind. He wore a faded canvas jacket that had seen better decades, and a weathered cap pulled low over his eyes. While everyone else saw a useless tombstone of twisted metal, Elias was watching the rusted heap with a strange, piercing intensity. His eyes traced the jagged lines of the axle. He saw something beneath the decay, something that made his rough hands tighten into fists inside his pockets. And that was the exact moment Marcus Vance decided to make himself the center of attention. Marcus was the regional distributor for the largest agricultural machinery syndicate in the Midwest. He was a man who wore a $2,000 Italian suit to a dirt lot auction. He had a heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist and pristine leather boots that had never touched a single drop of actual farm mud. Marcus did not build things. He financed them at exorbitant interest rates. He loved hearing the sound of his own voice, and he loved making sure everyone in the county knew exactly who held the power. Seeing the rusted carcass of Lot 42, Marcus stepped out from the crowd and pointed a manicured finger at the machine. He let out a sharp, echoing laugh that cut right through the freezing air. "Well, boys," Marcus shouted, making sure the auctioneer stopped talking. "Look at this magnificent piece of garbage. I would not pay $5 for that scrap metal unless I needed a heavy anchor for a pontoon boat. It is obsolete. It is broken. And quite frankly, it is a sad waste of the earth it is sitting on." The crowd chuckled uncomfortably. A few men looked down at their boots, too afraid to disagree with the man who held the financing notes on their own equipment. The auctioneer cleared his throat and asked if anyone would start the bidding at $50 just to cover the cost of hauling it to the landfill. The lot was dead silent. Only the wind howled. Then Elias Thorne slowly pulled his right hand from his canvas pocket and raised a battered wooden bidding paddle. $150, Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable heavy weight. The entire auction yard went dead silent for a split second before erupting into roaring laughter. It was a cruel, mocking sound. Marcus Vance wiped a tear of amusement from his eye and walked right up to Elias, standing uncomfortably close. "Elias," he said, shaking his head in mock pity. "I knew your farm was struggling, but I did not realize you had decided to open a junkyard. You are living in the past, old man. That rusted piece of trash is exactly like your outdated way of farming. Dead, broken, and useless. You should just sell me your land now, before you starve to death playing with scrap metal in the dirt." Elias did not blink. He did not step back. He calmly handed his $150 in crumpled, worn bills to the clerk, looked Marcus dead in the eye, and said a man who only looks at the paint job usually misses the engine. But there was something nobody in that laughing crowd knew, something that was about to turn this arrogant town completely upside down. The laughter followed Elias all the way out of the fairgrounds, but he did not care. He loaded the massive rusted lump onto his flatbed truck, the old suspension groaning under the immense weight of the iron. The drive back to the Thorne family farm was quiet, just the sound of the tires humming against the cracked asphalt. His farm was a modest 150 acres of tough, unforgiving soil at the edge of the county line. It had been in the Thorne family for 4 generations, but times had been brutally hard. 2 years of severe drought, followed by plummeting crop prices, had pushed Elias to the absolute brink. The mailbox at the end of his dirt driveway was stuffed with angry red stamped letters from the bank threatening imminent foreclosure. Yet when Elias backed the flatbed into his dimly lit drafty barn that evening, he did not look like a man who was defeated. He looked like a man with a purpose. You see, to understand Elias Thorne, you have to understand the man who raised him. Elias grew up under the shadow of his grandfather, a master mechanic who believed with all his heart that machinery had a living, breathing soul. His grandfather used to sit him on an overturned bucket in this very barn and tell him that a machine only truly dies when the last man who understands it gives up on it. Elias lived by a code that the modern throwaway world had completely forgotten. He believed in fixing what was broken, not discarding it for something shiny and hollow. He believed that the dirtiest, hardest work often hid the greatest value. The modern world told him he was foolish. Men like Marcus Vance told him he was obsolete. But Elias knew that the soil did not care about computerized touchscreens or expensive suits. The soil only respected sweat, blood, and truth. He rigged up a heavy chain hoist to the main support beam of the barn and slowly lowered the rusted behemoth onto the packed dirt floor. He pulled a string overhead, turning on a single bare, incandescent bulb that cast long, dancing shadows against the wooden walls. He dragged an overturned metal bucket next to the machine, sat down, and let out a long, slow breath. He was surrounded by debt, by mocking voices, and by the very real threat of losing his family legacy. But right now, none of that mattered. He picked up a wire brush and a heavy-gallon jug of industrial solvent. He had a lot of work to do, and what he was going to find beneath that crust of rusted iron would change his life forever. I need to stop here and tell you what was really at stake, because this story was never just about fixing an old tractor, while Elias was breathing in the sharp, stinging scent of kerosene and old iron. In the cold isolation of his barn, Marcus Vance was standing under the blinding stadium lights of his dealership showroom across town. Marcus was hosting a massive promotional event designed to dazzle the local agricultural community. There was catered food, a blaring sound system, and sitting right in the center of it all was his crown jewel, a $2 million fully autonomous tractor encased in flawless green paint and tinted glass. It looked more like a spaceship than a farm implement. Marcus stood on a raised platform, holding a microphone, wearing a patronizing smile as he addressed the crowd of indebted, desperate farmers. He told them that the future belonged only to those who were willing to pay for it. He told them that tradition was just another word for failure. And then, to get a cheap laugh from the crowd, Marcus brought up Elias. He pointed toward the county road and painted a pathetic picture of the stubborn old man, freezing in a dark barn, scrubbing a worthless piece of junk he bought for $150. Do not end up like Elias Thorne. Marcus warned, his voice booming through the speakers. If you do not adapt, if you do not buy into this modern system, the modern world will crush you and leave you playing with scrap metal in the dirt. The crowd chuckled nervously. The rumors spread like wildfire through the small town over the next 2 days. People drove past the Thorne farm, shaking their heads, whispering about how the bank was going to take the land, and how old Elias had finally lost his mind. He was completely isolated, a relic of a forgotten era, standing against a tidal wave of corporate money and modern arrogance. But there was a profound secret waiting in the shadows of that wooden barn. Something that money could not buy, and arrogance could never recognize. For 3 straight days and nights, Elias barely slept. The wind rattled the loose boards of the barn, but inside, Elias was entirely consumed by his quiet, methodical work. His hands were blackened and bleeding from the sharp, jagged edges of flaking metal, but he did not stop. He worked with the reverence of an archaeologist unearthing a lost civilization. As the thick, hardened crust of mud, rust, and grease slowly began to fall away to the dirt floor, Elias started to notice things. Things that did not make sense. He ran his calloused fingers over the rear axle housing. It was not cast in the perfectly round shape of the standard production models from the 1920s or 30s. It was square, heavily reinforced, and secured with an abnormal bolt pattern that Elias had only ever seen in faded black and white sketches from his grandfather's old manuals. It was a design flaw that had supposedly never made it to the mass production line. Elias frowned, leaning closer. He grabbed a heavy steel scraper and began to work on the primary engine casing right near the exhaust manifold. As he chipped away a solid block of petrified grease, his scraper hit something that did not produce the sharp ping of cast iron. It was a duller, softer sound. He put the scraper down. He grabbed a clean rag, soaked it heavily in solvent, and began to gently rub the spot. What he saw emerging under the pale yellow beam of his flashlight made his heart stop completely in his chest. It was a small rectangular plate, riveted directly into the engine block. It was not iron. It was solid brass. It was completely black with age, but as Elias wiped away the decades of grime, the faint indentations of letters began to catch the light. They were not perfect uniform letters stamped by an automated machine. They were slightly uneven, driven into the brass by hand with a heavy mallet. Elias leaned in so close, his breath fogged the cold metal. The brass plate read, Experimental Prototype Number E01. Waterloo, Iowa, 1917. Elias slowly sat back on his overturned bucket and exhaled a breath he felt like he had been holding for his entire life. This was not a broken tractor. This was a ghost. It was the absolute holy grail of American agricultural history. It was the legendary lost prototype of the very first 2-cylinder engine that forged the entire John Deere empire. Historians and collectors universally believed this specific machine had been scrapped and melted down for the war effort in 1918. It was the missing link, the foundation of a billion-dollar legacy standing right here in a drafty barn on a bankrupt farm. And Marcus Vance, the self-proclaimed expert of machinery, had literally stood over it, kicked it, and called it a $150 boat anchor. I need to tell you what happened next because the tension in that town was about to snap. The morning of the 3rd day, the violent roar of a luxury V8 engine shattered the quiet peace of the Thorne farm. Marcus Vance had decided to pay a personal visit. His massive, pristine black truck rolled up the muddy driveway, intentionally splashing dirt onto the weathered wooden siding of Elias's house. Marcus stepped out, looking around at the modest, struggling farm with absolute disgust. He walked straight into the barn, uninvited, pulling a crisp white envelope from his tailored jacket. Elias was standing by a workbench, wiping grease from his hands. "Look at you, Elias," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You look tired. The whole town is laughing at you, old man. I am here to do you a favor. The bank is going to take this land by the end of the month. I am willing to offer you 50 cents on the dollar for the acreage right now. It is a terrible investment for me, but I hate seeing a stubborn old fool starve to death." Marcus held out the envelope, expecting Elias to break, expecting him to surrender his pride and his family legacy to the man with the money. Elias did not even look at the envelope. He looked at Marcus with a calmness that was absolutely terrifying. He tossed his greasy rag onto the bench. "You are standing in my barn, Marcus," Elias said, his voice low and steady as bedrock. "You are stepping on my dirt, and if you do not get off my property right now, I am going to throw you out myself." Marcus scoffed, his face turning red with sudden anger. "Have it your way, old man," he spat, turning on his heel. "Die in the dirt with your garbage. I will buy this land at the foreclosure auction next month for a fraction of the price." Marcus stormed out his tires, spinning violently in the mud as he sped away, believing he had already won. But as the sound of the truck faded into the distance, Elias Thorne walked quietly out of the barn and into his dusty kitchen. He did not look at the threatening letters from the bank. He walked over to the wall, picked up the heavy receiver of his old rotary phone, and dialed a very specific number he had kept tucked inside his grandfather's leather-bound ledger for decades. He was not calling a local scrapyard. He was dialing an office located hundreds of miles away in Moline, Illinois, the corporate headquarters and historical archives of the John Deere Corporation. When a man finally answered the line, Elias spoke only a few quiet sentences. He described the square axle, the unusual hand-stamped rivets, and finally, the exact wording on the brass plate. He did not know it yet, but those few words were about to trigger a chain reaction that Marcus Vance could never have seen coming. When the man on the other end of the line in Moline finally spoke, his voice was trembling so badly he could barely form the words. He ordered Elias not to touch another piece of metal on that machine, not to tell another soul, and demanded his exact physical address. The morning of the 5th day brought a strange and entirely unexpected procession to the quiet roads of Oakhaven. A sleek black corporate SUV, followed closely by an enclosed heavy transport truck, rolled slowly down the main street. They did not slow down when they reached Marcus Vance's glittering glass showroom. Marcus was standing in his massive floor-to-ceiling window, holding a cup of premium coffee, watching in absolute confusion as the highest-level corporate vehicles from the brand he represented drove right past his empire without even tapping the brakes. Curiosity and a sudden prickle of anxiety got the better of him. Marcus tossed his coffee in the trash, jumped into his luxury truck, and followed the heavy transport all the way to the edge of the county. He followed them right onto the muddy, pothole-ridden driveway of the Thorne family farm. By the time Marcus parked his truck, Elias was already standing outside his barn, leaning quietly on a wooden pitchfork. 3 men in sharp, expensive suits were practically sprinting across the muddy yard, completely ignoring the deep, freezing sludge that was ruining their Italian leather shoes. One of them was the Vice President of Heritage and Acquisitions for the John Deere Corporation. The other was the Chief Historical Archivist. Marcus Vance marched up behind them, a condescending sneer already forming on his face to hide his confusion. He figured corporate had finally come to repossess Elias's old equipment or personally serve him a blacklist notice. Marcus actually pushed his way to the front and yelled out, "Hey boys, if you are looking for scrap metal to offset a bad loan, the old man has got a nice $150 boat anchor sitting right in there." What happened next was the part that nobody in Oakhaven ever forgot. The chief historian did not even acknowledge Marcus. He walked through the barn doors and fell directly to his knees in the dirt. He did not care about his suit. He crawled right up to the cleaned-off brass plate on the engine block, reached out with a trembling hand, and actually began to weep. Tears streamed down the face of a man who had dedicated his entire life to the history of agricultural engineering. The vice president turned to Elias, his voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and sheer awe. Mr. Thorne, the executive, said, taking off his hat in a gesture of profound respect, "We have been looking for this machine for over 80 years. Our entire corporate museum in Illinois has an empty space waiting for it. The original blueprints sit in a vault, but the entire world thought this machine was dead." Marcus Vance stepped forward, his arrogant sneer faltering into a mask of pale panic. "What are you talking about?" Marcus demanded, his voice shrill and desperate. "It is a piece of garbage. I inspected it myself at the auction. I stood right over it. It is worth $50 in scrap weight. You can not be serious." The vice president slowly turned to look at Marcus Vance, his expression turning as cold and hard as stone. "You inspected this?" he asked quietly, the sheer disgust evident in his tone. "You are supposed to be our premier regional distributor. You represent our brand, and you looked at the single most important piece of mechanical history in our company's entire existence, and you called it scrap. You do not know the first thing about what you are selling, Marcus. You only know how to read an invoice and exploit the men who actually do the work." Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The blood drained entirely from his face. He looked from the executives to the rusted machine, and finally, to Elias. Elias did not gloat. He did not smile. He did not throw the insults back in Marcus's face. He just looked right back at the rich man with the calm, steady, unshakable gaze of someone who knew exactly what his own worth was. The vice president reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook that drew directly from the corporate treasury. "Mr. Thorne," he said respectfully, "we do not want this to ever go to a public auction. We want to bring her home today. We are prepared to offer you $420,000 right now, this very minute, to take ownership of this prototype." The number hung in the cold, dusty barn air like a thunderclap. $420,000 for a $150 hunk of rusted iron that everyone had laughed at. Marcus Vance's legs physically gave out. He stumbled backward, his expensive boots slipping in the mud until he hit the exterior wall of the barn, breathing heavily as his entire arrogant worldview shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The man who had mocked Elias in front of the whole town, the man who had called him stupid and outdated, had literally handed him nearly $500,000 because he was too blind to see past the rust. Elias slowly took his calloused hands out of his canvas pockets. He looked at the check, then at the machine that had saved his family's legacy. "She deserves to be remembered," Elias said quietly. "You can take her home." The aftermath of that single day changed the fabric of Oakhaven forever. The corporate team loaded the prototype into the climate-controlled transport truck with the kind of delicate reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. The story hit the regional news the next morning and dominated the national farming magazines by the end of the week. Elias Thorne, the quiet old man with the scarred hands, became a living legend. He took that corporate check, walked straight into the bank that had been threatening him for 2 years, and paid off every single cent of the mortgage on his farm. He bought a new roof for his barn, and he carefully repaired all of his grandfather's old hand tools. But the most amazing part of the story was what Elias did not do. He did not buy a shiny new truck. He did not purchase a massive computerized tractor with a climate-controlled cab. He just kept wearing his faded canvas jacket, working his land, and driving his battered old pickup, because a sudden fortune did not change who he was. He already had everything he needed. As for Marcus Vance, the humiliation was absolute and inescapable. When the local farming community found out that the hotshot dealer had publicly mocked and kicked the holy grail of tractors, his reputation evaporated overnight. Farmers stopped returning his calls. They stopped taking his advice. They realized that Marcus did not care about machinery or the people who worked the dirt. He only cared about the illusion of superiority and wealth. His sales plummeted into the ground. A month later, the corporate office quietly but firmly revoked his premium dealership status, citing a severe lack of historical and mechanical competence. The massive glass windows of his showroom seemed a lot less impressive to the town, when everyone knew the man sitting inside was a complete fraud. There is a profound, unspoken truth hiding in the dirt of the Thorne family farm. We live in a world that is desperately obsessed with the new, the shiny and the loud. We are constantly told by people in expensive suits that if something is old, if it is quiet, if it is a little rusted around the edges, it has absolutely no value. We are taught to judge books by their pristine covers and measure men solely by their bank accounts. But true worth does not ever scream for attention. It does not need to boast or mock. It waits patiently underneath the grime and the passage of time for someone wise enough and humble enough to recognize it. Elias Thorne did not win because he was lucky. He won because he possessed the patience to look closely at something the rest of the world had blindly discarded. He understood that respect for the past is the only foundation strong enough to build a lasting future. So the next time you see something broken, or the next time you meet someone the loud modern world has written off entirely, remember the quiet old farmer in Oakhaven and his $150 piece of scrap. Never underestimate the people who work in the silence, and never ever mistake a little rust for a lack of power.